All right, everyone, thank you for coming for the afternoon. It's right after lunch, and it's always a lower turnout time. And we got Heidi here to help us keep awake after lunch. That's always a tough one to get going on. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor in Ag and Applied Economics here. I'm Extension, and I'm also director of the Rank Agribusiness Institute and on the steering committee for the UW-Madison part of the Madison, the Dairy Innovation Hub. What we're going to do this afternoon is do the last session on the growing farm businesses and communities. And first up is going to be Heidi Zoerb in that group. We're going to do about 20 plus minutes for each the speakers, and Troy will be helping me out with the other speakers. And we just ask you to, we'll take the questions. Are we going to do it at the end again as well? Okay, we're going to do questions at the end again. So if you have questions, please submit them on the online group, with the chat function, and then we'll do our best to stay on time and go from there. Other than that, I think Heidi, you're ready to do your panel and introduce everyone. All right, so thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heidi Zoerb. I work for the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences here at UW-Madison. I'm the Associate Dean for External Relations and Advancement. And I'm here today to have a discussion with my colleague, Dr. Tera Montgomery, on student innovation competitions. That is a topic that is really of interest to me personally because agriculture, I feel like, is frequently left out of national conversations about innovation and entrepreneurship. You see lots of discussions about that, particularly on college campuses, related to pharmaceuticals and healthcare and other kinds of technology. So there's venture capital interest in those segments, and I just feel like agriculture is frequently not mentioned in those conversations. There are starting to be some shifts in those patterns. The broader dairy community is really trying to embrace that kind of innovation and entrepreneurship. For example, this year, the National Dairy Council's new product competition, any of you involved in that? It's focused on inventing good dairy food products for gamers, because apparently 91% of people who play video games snack while they're playing. So it seems like a good opportunity for dairy to bring some innovation there. We also think that the Dairy Innovation Hub is very well positioned to change this kind of dynamic for students in Wisconsin. And today we're going to talk about what we've done already in the first 2 years of the hub to do that and how we can continue to grow those types of products. So I'm very pleased to have joining me Dr. Tera Montgomery, who's a full professor of dairy animal science at UW-Platteville School of Agriculture. She's also the campus liaison at UW-Platteville for the Dairy Innovation Hub. She has a BS from UW-River Falls in animal science, a master's from the University of Maryland College Park, and a PhD from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She joined the faculty of the School of Agriculture in 2009 with a primary focus on undergraduate teaching, having developed courses in dairy records analysis, calf and heifer production, and small ruminant dairying. She also leads short-term faculty-led study abroad trips to explore agriculture in Romania, Spain, and England. And she's an advisor to the Pioneer Dairy Club, coaches the Dairy Challenge team, and is the advisor for a new student-managed dairy business that she's going to tell you a little bit more about in a bit. As you can see, she's the perfect speaker on this topic because of her deep experience providing these kinds of high-impact opportunities for students. So before we get to some of the specific projects the Dairy Innovation Hub has enabled, I'm going to ask Tera to start by describing the dairy research experiences she provides to UW-Platteville undergraduates through a 4-credit course that she teaches.
Thanks, Heidi. So,
I think I'm going to stand over here. Sorry.
perfect. So we have a couple of opportunities at UW-Platteville, specifically in dairy, that I wanted to talk about. So just as looking at some of these experiences as part of a course, the big picture in the middle, because I know the folks online can't necessarily see my, if I'm pointing at it, but we've got Pioneer Farm where we're milking roughly between 160 and 180 cows. And so this is my calf and heifer class. And with my calf and heifer class, we've done a number of research projects. And so because my primary responsibility is teaching, undergraduate research comes into play in the classroom. And depending on how many students we have, it can get a little bit challenging this particular semester. I have 24 students, which isn't too bad, but it's been as many as 60 students. And so sometimes getting undergraduate research in there can be a little bit challenging. But these particular students are taking colostrum, and they're taking a look at a product that's out there called DK2 and seeing whether or not it can bring down the bacteria count. Because what we know about science and practical practice on the farm is those two things don't always match up. So in order to be able to improve some profitability for farmers that maybe might let their colostrum sit around a little bit too long, we're using this product and going through multiple steps. So I've got groups of 2, there's 12 groups who are working on each of them a different protocol, and then I have an undergraduate research assistant who is kind of trying to herd the cats with me as far as that goes. We also had a local farm that reached out to us and asked for us to do some research on their farm. And again, this isn't necessarily something that's going to be published. Maybe we might get a white paper, but it's about getting the students the experience to see what does it mean to collect data, what does it mean to question some of the products that are out there as far as that goes. Another area that I work with undergraduate students on is senior design projects. So this particular group of students are mechanical engineers. And so I told the engineering faculty that I was having a problem with, I'll talk about Pioneer Sweets in a little bit, but we have to package the ice cream that you can see at the bottom of the screen there is in 8-ounce cups. And that is, it takes forever to do that. And big ice cream plants have packaging machines. Our little space is like the size of the table that's in front here, so it's not very big for these big packaging machines. And so I reached out and I said, can somebody design something that might be able to work? It was awesome working with these 4 guys. None of them came from a dairy farm. It turned out that one of them actually got suckered into working with another agriculture program as part of what he was doing in another class. But they were all like, I don't know anything about this. And so one of my goals is to make sure that every student at the university, regardless of their major, has some experience with dairy. And as we'll hear from some of my colleagues in a little bit, that includes engineering, social science. I've even reached out to some art faculty to see how we can, incorporate dairy and art. So it's really kind of cool to see how these students embrace the idea of figuring out how can we help the dairy industry. Even though this little machine that they came up with worked really well, it wasn't inspectable. So that's another learning experience to say, okay, that's fine, this works, but how do we actually make it so that it's food grade? And so that's kind of the next step. These guys were all seniors and they graduated in May, and so we're going to have a new round of students take a look at that. And then we've got individual undergraduate research experiences for credit. So this one, this is a student, Victoria Chanez, that I worked with on the ice cream project that Tom Zolper talked about in a session before the break. So if you want to go back and watch that if you didn't have a chance to, he's talking about the ice cream research that they did. He's a mechanical engineer who happened to be interested in rheological properties of ice cream, and I'm teaching a dairy products class, and so we provided the ice cream and the taste testers for some of his research. I'll let you talk, Heidi, about the
Can I just ask you one question before we get to that, Tara?
Sure.
Has the Dairy Innovation Hub changed any of the dynamics for your in-class research experiences?
Absolutely, absolutely. So some of what the Dairy Innovation Hub has been able to do is allow other faculty members across campus to be able to have access to some faculty fellowships. And so like I mentioned before, Shan and Claudine will be talking about one of their projects that they have, but we also have opportunities to get additional equipment on campus, especially at Pioneer Farm. And so some of those kinds of things are just building momentum in terms of being able to allow students to do more projects in the class, but also undergraduate research.
That's great. 60 students in a class with research in it is very impressive, although not as impressive as being an ice cream taste tester. I want to have that job. So while these kinds of for-credit opportunities are obviously really rich opportunities for students from any major to learn more about dairy, I think it's also true that not everything has to come with credit. There are lots of learning opportunities we can take advantage of that don't bear credit as well. And one of those is a project I worked on last year with the help of funding from the Hub. It was called the Dairy Innovation Student Challenge. This was based on like a curriculum that was developed by a colleague who isn't able to be here today, but she actually runs an innovation agency here in Madison, and has done a number of these kinds of student challenge competitions here at UW-Madison, many of them focused on engineers and the College of Engineering. But the general concept was that basically in roughly the timeline of a semester, you can recruit students from a wide variety of disciplines, have them brainstorm about specific solutions, invite in people from industry to vet some of those solutions, have the students narrow down what they're going to focus on, and spend the remainder of their time together working in teams to really flesh out those ideas and think about what a business plan could look like. So that's a really flexible kind of curriculum and can be used for anything. And it was fun to be able to apply it to 3 different questions or 3 different issues that were raised by the Dairy Task Force a couple of years ago. So we focused students on either using Internet of Things and new technologies to improve the dairy industry, or increasing youth milk and dairy product consumption, which was a major priority for the Dairy Task Force. And the third one, our third area of focus, was looking at new technologies for animal welfare. So the challenge, which was a challenge in so many ways because we ran it during the first full semester of COVID. So we received our funding thinking we were going to be able to do an in-person program, mostly centered in Madison, but wanted to make sure we invited students from Platteville and River Falls. So when we had to change to an online format, the one benefit was it was a lot easier to collaborate among the students at the 3 campuses. We ended up recruiting a total of 12 students. 10 of them were from UW-Madison. They were a mixture of undergraduate and graduate students. And we had 2 students who joined us from UW-River Falls. And the other thing that was nice in some ways about the virtual format, it was a lot easier for our mentors to participate. We could have people living anywhere in Wisconsin serve as mentors for the students because we were doing everything virtually. That was one of the reasons Tera was able to join us as a mentor, despite all of the other demands on her time. So the other thing that happened to the project is the timeline got a little bit reduced because the beginning of the semester, for those of you who were on a campus know, it was a little bit chaotic last fall. So we ended up doing it in 8 weeks, and we developed milestones for students and mentors every week, things we wanted the teams to be focusing on and the mentors to be talking to them about. This is what our curriculum looked like. If anybody's interested in seeing any of these materials, I'm more than happy to share them with folks. And mentors were, of course, a major part of our program. They really made things better. And like, I have to tell you, this is one of those moments, you guys probably have these too after last year, where you see a screen capture of some Zoom thing and you have like sort of mixed emotional feelings. That's how I feel about this. But we spent 8 weeks, an hour at least every week together as an entire cohort group, mentors and students, and this was from our final challenge. So Mary Grace Erickson, a PhD student here in animal and dairy science, was kind enough to do a formal evaluation of our project at the end. So we have real findings we can share. For the students, the things that they valued most were being connected to industry professionals, and having experience in a creative process, whether it was related to their career path or not. They asked that we have more structure around things, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. They wanted more explicit instructions about what they should be doing every week. They wanted a longer time frame, not surprisingly. And they would have liked the addition of in-person meetings. On the mentor side, which was also a real benefit to us to have those people engaged with us, What they valued the most was interacting with people from outside of their own personal networks, including the students and people of different ages. They also wanted more structure in the weekly meetings, and they thought that we should have had a separate contest for graduate students and undergraduates. Knowing what our sort of formal evaluation process is, Tera was a mentor for a student team. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you saw as a result of that?
Yeah, so I will say that I am not surprised with what the students had to say, because they say that in our classes all the time. They want more structure, they want more time, and they want to be in person. We're starting to be able to at least be in person. But in terms of working with the students, it was a lot of fun for me. The student who I was working with, she was very motivated and very excited about trying to get milk into the hands of athletes at the high school level, and so that was a lot of fun. But I also learned a lot from the other mentors and listening to the other students talk about their projects. It was fascinating to hear from the graduate students, but it was also a little bit kind of a bummer, because these people, there was a PhD student who had been doing this for eons and really knew what she was talking about and had presented a lot before and things like that. But I think it was kind of good for the undergraduates to also learn from the graduate students and to see what you might do if you went on to further schooling. But it was, you know, I did it because I work with students all the time in a variety of different ways, and this was a way to give back, partly because it was a Dairy Innovation Hub project. As soon as I saw it, I reached out to Heidi and I was like, how can I be involved in that, and how can we do more? I was a little bummed that we didn't have some UW-Platteville students, but I think everybody was zoomed out. So honestly, the fact that there was this many students that participated was pretty impressive as far as that goes. So I'm hoping that we can figure out a way to keep it moving forward in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's enough about that particular competition. There is a poster in the room downstairs if anybody wants to see more information. And now to the thing I've really been waiting to find out about in this session. As Tera forecasted, UW-Platteville is providing students with a completely hands-on opportunity right now to create their own entrepreneurial business experience with Pioneer Sweets ice cream business. So I'm going to let her tell us what that's like. And I'm hoping that I can sign up to be a taster.
Absolutely. Come on down anytime. We're definitely not trying to be...
Sorry. Keep going.
That's all right. We're not trying to be Babcock Hall by any stretch. This is something that's unique and different just for us. So one of the things that the students did, we started in February of 2020. Yep. And then we stopped in March of 2020. So that was a little crazy. The fact that I have 3 students that have hung on with me this long to actually launch and get going and are willing to do crazy things to try to get ice cream in the hands of people who apparently are experiencing it and liking it right now. We're excited about that. But they, you know, they helped design the logos, and the logos have turned into all sorts of things like competitions to name the cow. She doesn't have a name yet. We're working on that. Social media and all that sort of thing. I mentioned working with art students. So this space is in an old part of our old commons that nobody ever goes into. It was kind of a dark corner. And we retrofitted it and turned it into a dairy plant. So it's a licensed wholesale dairy plant. But there's just a whole bunch of blank walls. And so I reached out to one of the faculty who teaches art, and I said, I'd like a mural on the wall. And so I worked with the students to design a mural. They had some ideas, I had some ideas, we worked back and forth. And it was too cold for them to do their outside mural, so they came in and did this one first, and then March 2020 happened, and so they couldn't do their other mural anyway. So this was their art piece. And so while it's not exactly public, I try to get it out there as much as possible because I think it's kind of cool. And of course it has our M on there. But this is our first ice cream that we made. We called it Chancellor's Choice. It's vanilla because our chancellor only likes vanilla. And of course there's the orange and blue sprinkles because, you know, orange and blue, Pioneer colors. But we had some really cool opportunities to have a launch and get people together, even though we all had to be, you know, on Zoom and talking about what is this going to look like and how are we going to do this in October. So last month, about a month ago, we had our grand opening. So that was pretty exciting. The students had to decide who were we going to buy the ice cream from. They wanted to stay in Wisconsin, so we had to find a company in Wisconsin that could sell us a pre-pasteurized mix. We're not making our own mix right now, but that's hopefully in the future something we're going to do. We were gifted a machine from food science here in Madison. That was a little bigger machine than what we had before, because we've been using it for, I don't know, probably 6 years doing flavor development in the class that I was talking about, Tom Zolper's class, the research, and so that class was doing some flavor development, and that's what kind of turned this into, the students said, why can't we offer this more broadly? And then we also had a local nonprofit that wanted to sell our ice cream at their museum. So it's in Mount Horeb. And so we had to have a plant in order to be able to do that. And so the students helped work through all of that. What does it take to be a plant? What does it take to actually get inspected? What can you have? What can't you have? They came through with the inspectors. They looked at the paperwork, all those kinds of things. We're doing price analysis. What will people pay? What does it cost us to make it? What will dining services pay for it? What will they not? What kinds of flavors do people want? Things like that. So there we go. There's two of my students at the homecoming gala. That was our mocha chip, my flavor, because I get to create some too, which makes it a lot of fun. But we gave it out to a whole bunch of people. Here's some of the students. Our lab is not, where we do most of the flavor development, is not an inspectable lab, because if any of you are familiar with what this is up here, that is a meat rack. And so we are in our meats lab and our dairy products lab. We're not in there at the same time, but it's not an inspectable lab. And so they get to try different things. You can see all the different types of ingredients that they have laid out there. And then these students had been in that class, and now they're taking it a step further and making it into a business as far as that goes. I could talk forever about this, so if anybody has any questions, I'll happily talk about it later. But was there anything that you wanted to end up with there, Heidi?
I just wanted to say quickly that I think one of the positives of doing this kind of work with students is they bring so much enthusiasm to everything, even under really difficult circumstances, and that's a great thing. And the other really positive thing about this is it can also be a very meaningful way for alumni or other friends of your institution to engage in a meaningful way and help build their relationship with the institution. So we will be very happy to take questions about all of Tera's projects and my one project at the end of the session. So we'll turn it back to you.
So thank you again, Heidi and Tera. That was amazing. I'm thinking of flavors right now: chocolate, chocolate, and more chocolate. So I'm Troy Runge. I'm serve as a chair for the Madison Steering Committee for the Dairy Innovation Hub. I'm a chair of the Biological Systems Engineering and a professor. And I do a little bit of science too, but very little with those other titles. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Albert Boaitey. If you want to come up, Albert. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics. He's at River Falls. He teaches agricultural price and marketing, does some research in the economics of livestock production and consumption. Please welcome Albert.
Thanks for the very kind invitation. It's always a difficult task to speak after a group presentation, so I'm going to try my best to do that. Today I'm going to talk about the current project that I'm working on with my co-investigator, Dr. Sylvia Kehoe. We are essentially looking at calf management practices, animal welfare within the context of improving the social sustainability of the dairy industry. For this particular talk, I'm not going to speak on the calf management piece. I'm mainly focusing on stakeholder perspective in relation to social sustainability in the dairy industry. All right, so the broad goal of this project is how do we strategically position the dairy industry in Wisconsin to address some of the social concerns that people have, because we know that the science can be right, the production method can be right, but the perception of the public really influences their long-term profitability. And so our goal is to try to understand some of these issues from a social sustainability perspective. And before I start to delve deep into this, I want to highlight the fact that the framework that we are using is we are thinking about farmers and consumers as co-creators of sustainable systems. And I think this paradigm is very different from having sort of an antagonistic perspective where you see farmers are against consumers and so forth. We are thinking about having some type of a collaborative framework with bi-directional engagement and feedback loop. So here our goal was to talk to both sides in terms of understanding where they are to identify points of convergence. And the issue about social sustainability, I think, has been at the forefront for a long time. The 1987 World Commission of Development report kind of came up with a definition for sustainability. And over time, a lot of international development documents have kind of tried to craft definitions for social sustainability. And the recent one that I was looking at was the SDG goal number 2, which in essence look at sustainable agriculture that appears to balance economics, environmental resilience, and some type of social element. In this case, they were looking at the well-being of workers on dairy farms. So in a much broader context, the concept of social sustainability looks at society's expectations and concerns about impacts of agriculture. And you could clearly see from here the type of complexity that we are dealing with. One of it is the fact that this is a continuously evolving concept. What society thinks today will be entirely different from what society thinks tomorrow. And so having to understand this is a complexity that we have to deal with in this way. I think that the question that emanates from this is, where does the dairy industry fit here? There's good news and there's bad news. Okay, so I'll say the bad news first. The bad news is that when most members of the public or consumers think about sustainable agriculture or their idea of the ideal farm, unfortunately, is dairy. Okay, so everybody thinks the most romantic view of agriculture is dairy farming. Okay, that is the good news. The bad news is that an increasingly high proportion of the public is disconnected. Some of the estimates I have seen is that we are about 2.5 generations away from the farm. This is important because here is somebody thinking about what is ideal, but in reality, they are very much increasingly disconnected. When you look at the market, we have a situation where in terms of the consumption of fluid milk, there is very rapid changes that has very important implications. And some of those changes are being driven by societal expectations around how animals are treated and a number of social ethical concerns. So this is the complex problem within which we actually find ourselves, which necessitate the fact that we have to really understand what is going on if we want to save the dairy industry going forward into the future. So as part of this work, we looked at 6 social sustainability indicators, which we focus more on the external piece, which is the production of safe product, food safety, opportunity for cattle to graze. We also looked at the contribution of dairy farms to rural landscape. We look at animal welfare. We look at the welfare of labor on dairy farms. And we also look at cattle health. These sort of were done looking at the literature and in consultation with some of our industry and experts. So to conceptualize that, this is how it fits into sort of the big categories that we have. Multifunctionality, which comprises grazing and landscape, product quality, which looks at the safety of the milk product, and what we call acceptable concerns, which look at animal welfare, animal health, and issues around livelihoods of hard labor. So what we wanted to do based on the framework that we have was to talk to the two sides. So what we did was that we conducted a farmer survey, which we talked to reached out to 800 farms. Surprisingly, given that we are looking at a controversial issue, our response rate was pretty high. We had about 35% response rate on the farmer survey. On the consumer survey, we use Qualtrics they have a balanced panel of respondents in the US, and so we sampled about 1,000 of them. And what we did was that we gave them the same issues that we looked at, the 6 that I showed previously, and to see how they rate them. And then based upon that, we were able to create relative importance index for the different characteristics and how it varies when you look at farmer social dynamic profile and consumer social demographic profile. I'll show some of the results. So here, these are the issues that we have. These are the relative importance scores that we have created. And you can see very clearly from here that, I hope my friends online can see the light, but you can see very clearly from here that it appears that both consumers and farmers appear to place a relatively high importance on having a safe product, which we can see very, very clearly from here. We also see that from the consumer perspective, animal health, cattle having access to grading was sort of the third thing. And what they valued really low relative to the other elements we looked at was the landscape quality. So they did not tend to internalize the value of the contribution of dairy to landscape quality. On the other hand, we noticed that farmers also valued food safety. They tended not to value cattle access to grazing, which is interesting, but they put a lot of value on the contribution of dairy to landscape quality, in addition to the other variables that we looked at. And so what we ended up doing was we wanted to test how these ratings compared to each other. So you could see from here, we took the difference between the ratings that we had on the previous slide to see where there's some opportunity for convergence and where there is differences. When the negative is when the farmer ratings were higher than the consumer ratings, and the positives was when the consumer ratings were higher than the farmer ratings. And you could see very clearly that there is a lot of divergence between farmers and consumers on access to grazing and landscape quality on the other hand. We also see, which I thought was very interesting, that food safety tended to be a higher priority for farmers than consumers, and the welfare of high labor and animal health was more. We see quite a bit of convergence, at least based on this data, on animal welfare. So I think that there is some good news, and we may have to address this. So the next question that we wanted to look at was, let's look at the social demographic characteristics of consumers and how that relates to their preferences in somewhat to the different attributes that we looked at. And you could see that when we look at age, older people tend to value food safety and animal health, which is, when you are getting old, you have to think about your health. So it made sense. And then you look at, they did not appear to put a lot of value on landscape quality. All right. Consistent with the literature, we also noticed that male respondents tend not to value animal welfare, which is very consistent. Here, we also noticed that people who live in the cities tend to have a higher premium on landscape quality. If all you see is buildings and cars every day, it makes sense that you would appreciate this. And those who said that they were vegetarians appear to have a higher relative importance for animal welfare than those who did not, which is very interesting if you look at the regulatory piece of animal welfare, that people who don't necessarily consume the product may actually have a higher value for it. Then we tend to look at our farm data to see how the characteristics of the producer and the farm actually impacted the preferences for these attributes. And one of the things that we notice here is that When you look at the age of the producer, older farmers tend not to value cattle access to grazing, but they tend to value the welfare of high labor, which I think, in my opinion, made sense. When you're getting old, you probably want to get more hands on the farm to help you out. We also realize that the scale of operation, the size of the farm has some effect in terms of animal welfare. So that was surprising to me that larger farms appear to have a higher value for animal welfare, but they tend to discount cattle access to grazing, which may be a reflection of some of the logistical challenges that they have to incur if they want to provide that attribute. We also see that education appear to have some type of a significant impact on the appreciation for animal welfare. All right. So what are some of the conclusions? At least with these preliminary results, we are seeing that consumers tend to place a higher level of importance on sort of the health and food safety attributes of the food. We see that there's some element of convergence in some of the acceptable practices on the food quality. We also notice that the largest divergence or difference was when you look at multifunctionality, which is the value of grazing or cattle to rural landscape versus access to grazing. Conceptually, those two should be part of the same category, but we are seeing differences in how consumers and the public value that. Consumers and farmers value that. So from a policy industry perspective, what we want to conclude is that given that consumers are the drivers of value in food supply chains, it is important that the industry addresses some of the concerns that we have found relating to high labor and animal welfare and animal health. I think that from an industry strategy perspective, highlighting the food safety benefits of dairy or producing a safe dairy product, I think is still a good selling point, that people really care about whether their food is safe and healthy. The issue of grazing, access to grazing, is something that the industry, I think, should find a way to address, because it appears that there's a lot of differences between consumers and farmers on that issue. And so with that, I would like to acknowledge the help and support of my project collaborators from the U of M, Sylvia Kehoe, my colleague at the UW River Falls, and Jennifer Van Oos at the University of Madison. If you do have any questions that I cannot address, please send me an email. That's my email contact. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Albert. What we're going to, I'll wait till the things are up. All right, thanks, Albert. What we're going to do next is Claudine PA and Shan Sappleton are going to present together, is my understanding. I'm going to get this up closer. Claudine's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at UW-Platteville. Her research is focused on rural politics and economic change and land ownership across and access in the U.S., whereas Shan is a professor of political science at UW-Platteville. She focuses on comparative and international politics. Her research focuses on Francophone West Africa, ethnic politicization, I can't say that, and democratic consolidation. So please come on up and let's hear your presentation. Everyone, please welcome them.
Thank you. I guess we don't have to introduce ourselves now. Yeah. So we are going to be talking about changes in agricultural land and the effects that it has on rural communities and the dairy industry. As was just described, my background is in studying rural places, and so that's what brought me to this project. So to start with, just big picture, well-rehearsed, lots of literature on some of the changes that we've seen in the agriculture industry in general in the United States. This is breaking down the percentage of farms that are small farms, and then comparing that also to the percentage of land operated and the percentage of value production, which goes down, smaller percentage for small farms as we go down. And that we're especially concerned with or paying attention to the percentage of land operated by small and mid-sized farms, and some changes that we've seen over decades, of course, with that. And that brings us to our question of how have these sorts of changes in agriculture, and especially in the dairy industry in Wisconsin, how is that affecting the dairy industry itself and rural communities?
And so for our research methods, we use both qualitative and quantitative methods, and we've divided the project over the course of the project into two phases. Phase one is primarily where we engage in qualitative research, focusing mainly on the areas, Dane and Grant County and neighboring communities around Dane and Grant counties, and more particularly, we used interviews in our first phase, primarily semi-structured, in-depth interviews. Our study population included dairy farmers and other types of farmers, but also municipal leaders and members of the broader community. And what we actually found is that even though we had municipal leaders and other members of the community, they almost all had some connections to dairy farm, either having grown up on dairy farms or have family members who have in the recent past operated dairy farms or are currently operating dairy farms. So far, we have interviewed 55 people as of this week. and so our interviews, COVID is a reality this past year. So while our intent was to have in-person, face-to-face interviews for those 1 and 2 hour time slots, we ended up having to do all of our interviews actually via Zoom, and still within a 1 to 2 hour time slot, but nonetheless, we were able to interview as of this week, 55 people for this project. To analyze our data, we relied on a software which focuses both on analyzing qualitative and quantitative research, and so we started to code. We started coding our interview data using Max QDA, and blinking is happening. Is that a sign? Max QDA focusing on how participants are actually talking about farm loss. So our research approach is largely inductive, where our aim is to discern hard to observe trends or patterns amongst observations, particularly how participants are engaging or relating to the issues related to farm loss. So as you will see from our findings, they are largely informed by or based on the themes and patterns that emerge from our existing data. While we will continue, right, so our findings are from the bottom up, rather than the deductive approach, which generally goes from the top down. Like, we're not testing hypotheses, we're using the data of what individuals say to inform our research. For phase two, we have developed a survey, so we're currently in phase two of the research project. We've developed our survey, which we're in the process of sending out. And just a quick plug, if you're interested in signing up to take our surveys, we have a sign-up sheet after. Reach out to us, and we'll provide you the link to. We'll send you a link of that survey. While we continue to. Good. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh. I was thinking also while Shan was talking, compared to some of my other research that I've done for this project, people actually want to talk to us, which I think is telling us of the significance of this as something that's really impacting people's lives, and they're anxious to share their stories with people. So as Shan was saying, thinking from the bottom up and looking at the different patterns that we've seen, I'm going to just briefly introduce a few of those patterns that we're focusing in on, and then we're going to hone in on one of them a little bit more. So I'm getting ahead of myself. So first, as a project that's focusing especially on land, we end up seeing the connections to land to these other social factors. And probably most importantly, there's a strong tie between land and family. So it's hard to talk about changes in land without also talking about changes in family. So thinking of things like, talking with people, often one of the first questions we ask is, how long have you lived here, and that automatically leads to a conversation not just about the place, but about the family, because those are very interconnected with each other. And so we want to draw attention to and think more about how that change in land is also affecting changes in family and how people talk about that. Sometimes the kind of romantic notion of the family and its connection to the family farm, as was talked about, is maintained even though there are these conflicting changes that are actually happening in practice. And similarly, as land is lost to development and consolidation, as agricultural land is lost to development and consolidation, we've found a lot of confliction between thinking of the family as, thinking of the farm as family first and then the farm as a business first. And by conflict with that, we mean sometimes there were people that were very, very focused on, I need to make decisions about my farm as a business and not think about the significance of the generations past and the significance of the family, and maybe blaming other people for having done that in the past and made the wrong decisions for their farm. And then also conflict internally that people go through for addressing those questions themselves of making decisions about their farm for the next generations, and holding that weight at the same time, also wanting to focus on the significance of business. So thinking about that conflict within the community and then internal conflict as well. Third, despite having strong connections to the land, farmers and community members rarely talk about land as a solution. By this we don't mean things like selling part of the land or changing what's harvested on the land. Those individual decisions, price of land, all of those things of course came up. But thinking about things like conservation easements or what policies could be put in place to try to increase or maintain more land in agriculture, that's less something that came up, and it just doesn't seem to be on the forefront of people's minds, that sort of more large-scale decision. And then what we're going to focus on today is thinking about the role of political polarization in all of this, with the idea that it's out there, it's influencing people, and it's influencing responses to the dairy industry. This is not something, this is one of the benefits, I think, of doing an inductive approach. It's not something we set out to necessarily monitor, but it just kept coming up. And so we pay attention to it, and we look at what are the patterns and how people are talking about it. So this is just recognition that, of course, it's been well documented that we have this increased polarization nationally in terms of political parties. It does get a little more complicated than that in thinking about what level is this political polarization happening at. Is it just the people who represent us? Is it something that affects people's day-to-day lives in their communities? So in looking at the scholarship on political polarization and its relationship to rural areas, first of all, it's important to recognize that farmers and others' political leanings influence how they respond to policy. So this is something that, another reason why it's important to pay attention to this. And there's a lot of talk about distinctions between rural and urban places, both kind of just nationally in media and in our interviews as well. And certainly, as this is telling us that there is a relationship between geographics and tendencies to vote in one direction or another. So in rural areas, or you could say the farther away from urban areas, the more likely people are to vote Republican. And then there's also studies in Wisconsin that have shown ideas about rural identity and rural resentment of urban places, with the idea that there's a lot of money and focus that go into the urban areas in Wisconsin, and that there are people in rural areas that are reacting to that. At the same time, there's a long history of scholarship within rural sociology, especially that focuses less so on the differences and more so on the interconnections between rural and urban places. And that's something that we are going to focus on a little bit, that we found in our research as well.
So first, in terms of the evidence of polarization that we see in our research consistent with what the scholarship suggests, first is avoiding politics, and we see that as evidence of polarization. Specifically, individuals that we interview are hesitant to talk politics, primarily because of the impression or the perception that it will drive further divisions within the community. And so we tend to find this expression of avoiding politics among our interviewees, whether they're municipal farmers or dairy farmers or other type of farmers. That's consistent across the board. And so the first quote that we have up there is by a municipal leader who stated, quote, "If we would take politics out of it all, I think we'd all get along better. There's too much right against left, and no matter what, the laws are trying to help everybody, but some people don't see it like that." The second quote gets at it a little bit more directly in terms of explicitly stating, "I just don't want to talk about politics at all." And so Frank, a 60-year-old farmer, actually stated, I quote, "I got burned out in the Trump administration for sure. I don't know. I don't want to talk about politics." And that was common throughout the interviews that we did.
Remind you all, we did not ask about politics specifically, so these are not in response to questions about the political beliefs at all.
And so despite the hesitancy to specifically talk about politics, at least in terms of stark divisions between Republican and Democratic, the interviewees did, or participants did, point to divisions that they were able to identify, political divisions within the community nonetheless, whether these were along the lines of liberal social cliques run conservative cliques, organic farmers versus conventional farmers, or in terms of new urban residents versus long-term rural residents. And so what the quote here that we've put up here shows is a woman in her 60s who married into a farm to our questions about the relationship between, as she sees it, between farming and religion, actually then states, careful to clarify here, that farmers tended to go to certain conservative churches more so than liberal churches. And so the quote the statement that she gave is, quote, "If you have to use liberal or conservative as terms," which points to the hesitancy to point to liberal or conservative in discussions related to divisions within the community. Nonetheless, she says, if you have to use liberal or conservative as terms, which I don't think are always very helpful terms, but if you had to use those two, my church is liberal leaning, which at many places does not connect deeply with some of the values that I think many farmers hold. God and country are very important values. And so in terms of how we've organized our preliminary findings so far, we have around political polarization specifically, we've organized them into three main categories, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more in depth. Rural, urban, environmentalists versus farmers, and the sentiment that farmers tend to be largely anti-government. Excuse me. As noted, as I just stated just now, interviewees tended to identify political divisions even as they sought to avoid speaking in direct Republican versus Democratic terms. In particular, this quote, as the scholars have actually found, conventional farmers and other rural communities are not only identified a divide within the agricultural community, but also describe divisions among environmentalists, specifically environmentalists from urban areas, as out of touch with agriculture and often as anti-farmers. And so this is a Jake, we call him Jake, who is in his 20s, who in response to our question stated, my family has a burning passion against organic farmers because they think they're so great, but really they just play off people's fears and just consciously turn their lands into less production solely for the benefit of manipulating more or less the consumer that doesn't know what things are. And since they don't know agriculture or terms or science or anything, things sound scary to them. Let me get this absolutely horrible managed wheat for like 50% more so it will make me feel better about myself. And while these examples are represented in our research data. It's not as direct and scathing in their commentary or in their critique. The sentiment nonetheless emerges quite frequently.
Okay. So now how we've shown you a little bit of what we mean by political polarization, and hopefully you get the sense, and probably not too surprised that that actually exists and how people are talking about these things. We want to also complicate this notion of political polarization and show ways in which we can also focus on connections that exist and ways in which it might not be as polarized or polarized in the same way as we think. So I have in the background here a map that what we commonly see, these red versus blue areas, and we could even have it even more dramatic looking if we were just looking red versus blue states. So we get used to seeing over and over again this idea of red as rural and blue, red rural Republican and blue urban Democrat. And we are going to complicate that by thinking about what we've seen and what we talk to people about. So, for example, a lot of people that we speak with who have farms that may be in this region here where we are, not too far outside of Madison, see themselves as rural because, and sometimes like the strongholds of the rural region because there's encroaching development around them, but still in agriculture and in part because of that cultural connection, rural, but of course they are in urban and suburban places if we look at how it's defined in terms of population. So that's an example of what we're talking about, that if we just focus on looking for the same patterns that fit into polarization, then we're missing some of this story of the overlap as well. Also, whether we were in urban, suburban, or rural areas, talking with farmers and people with a connection to agriculture, almost everyone who we talk to has some sort of connection to urban places, which is not too surprising because we're all pretty close together. But for example, this woman in her 50s who talked about growing up on a farm. My mom grew up in Chicago and knew nothing about the business end of a cow. My dad met her when they were in the Navy, and lo and behold, brought her back home to the farm. So this is a common story as well of spouses who connect, and maybe one has a long history of living in rural areas and one is more from an urban area. And then of course a lot of people's children go off and go to school in urban areas or move to different urban areas. So even though there is this angst of rural versus urban, and maybe the city folk don't understand what we're doing here, there's also that connection and sense of place. Also, I wanted to point out in all of those examples that we talked about of some of the polarization, a lot of that was happening within rural places, right? Political divisions that happen within rural places and not just urban versus rural in that sense. Also, what we've found in how people talk about environmentalism matches up with what a lot of other literature has found of farmers describing themselves as environmentalists as well. So farmers talked about soil and animal health practices as evidence of caring about the environment and the landscape, and also inherent to the interests of farmers because they want to protect their land to be able to pass it on and protect their farm. Farmers and environmentalists and government agency representatives sometimes describe this as conservative conservationists, as a way of connecting both of those things. Here's an example that it's sort of a critique of the environmentalist perspective at the same time, but it goes along with what I'm saying. So, so what's old is new, you know, grass waterways are not, that's a new concept. Grass waterways have been around. I used to walk cows across the road in pasture from one place to the next. So rotational grazing is not new. We did that, you know, we were doing it 30 years ago. It's just that maybe it's got a little piece of technology that's attached to it. So thinking of environmentalism and movements as things that also can and should come up from the bottom rather than just top down. And then the farmers versus government, and farmers being against government regulation. There's certainly evidence to support that, and so in some cases some people talk about being against environmentalism is actually rather against outside regulation than against environmentalism per se. So there certainly is that plenty of research to back that up. However, it depends on what the government policy is, of course, and here we're pointing to it also depends on, is it something that's going to benefit farmers, and will they see it in their pocketbooks, and will it have an impact on their farm for the good? And this again, this is another quote where you're seeing two things at once, a little hesitancy to it, but again, it's an acceptance of that policy. I was grateful for the pittance from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture and what Governor Evers channeled towards smaller farms. I don't want to be indignant, but I want to look at what tools are in the market to help us do that as well. So not closed off to government intervention somehow, but also wants to open up as many possibilities as solutions as possible.
And so just in closing, we'd like to talk about some of the implications of addressing farm loss and the policy component of that. So what our preliminary findings have suggested is a need for policymakers and policy solutions to to bear in mind or be aware of the level of polarization within society, and to make proposals for addressing these issues in a way that does not further polarize the community, to increase the divisions within these communities, specifically smaller communities, and so to point to and work with connections that serve to make potential inroads and allow for greater interconnectedness rather than aggravate, is the word I was looking for, aggravate further divisions within these societies.
I could give an example with that with the environmentalist versus farmer example that I talked about. That idea, we could use that to further polarize by saying that, farmers don't need environmentalists because they are their own environmentalists, but instead bringing forth policy and in a way with language that is focusing on the connections between environmentalists and farmers, and that there's a mutual connection to the landscape and the land, and interest in protection of that is an example of making those sort of connections. And that's it. Yes, these are Hayden Pierce and Ian Stetzel, our students who have been working closely with us, and then we've also had a few other students who are doing independent study projects that are kind of connected to what we're doing as well and infiltrate into that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Claudine and Shan. It is now time for our final speaker, Marin Skidmore. You can come on up here. She's a postdoctoral researcher at Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies here at UW-Madison. Right now she's studying the interaction of agriculture, development, and environment. Prior to doing it here at Wisconsin, she very excitingly was doing similar work on the Brazilian Amazon, looking at deforestation and how that impacted the cattle sector. So please welcome Marin.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. And thank you especially to Claudia and Shan. I could not have asked for sort of a better setup for this project. So really fun to see how the DIH projects all kind of link together. Today I will be presenting work with my colleagues Jeremy Foltz and Tina Andarge, effectiveness of local regulations on non-point source pollution, evidence from Wisconsin dairy farms. And this is one of the short-term high-impact grants funded by the DIH. All right, let's see if I can click. Nope, looks like. All right, I'm going to, if you could maybe make the page a little smaller, that would be wonderful. Anyway, I'll talk while they do that. Okay, so we all, I believe, live in Wisconsin, which means we're likely quite familiar that there is this ongoing tension between manure and water quality. If you live in Madison, you probably experience this in the summers as algae blooms that is coming from high levels of nutrients in our lakes, and elsewhere in the state we're seeing nitrate in our groundwater and in household wells. And with that comes a lot of efforts to try and curb runoff, try and curb this nutrient pollution from manure management. But as Claudia and Shan set up, This also comes with a lot of tension between different communities in the state, right? So a lot of concern from farmers about the burdens that are put on them by this regulation, a lot of real energy behind regulations of this nature from our environmentalists. And we know that especially on the farmer side, a lot of the concern is coming because this is a really challenging time for dairy farms in Wisconsin. Great. As countless, I think, presentations today have already said, we're losing hundreds and thousands of our small dairy farms over the last couple decades. And so it's never a good time to have regulation that isn't effective, but especially now it's really a challenging time and we don't want to be putting undue burdens on farmers for regulations if we're not sure the impact that they're having. And so what we wanted to try and contribute to this, what has largely been a largely political conversation, is some quantitative analysis. So we wanted to look and see, do manure management regulations improve surface water quality in Wisconsin, and look specifically then at which of our manure management regulations lower pollution levels. So when we're in this water pollution policy literature, almost all of the focus has been on point source pollution policy, things like the Clean Water Act. It's because this point source pollution is really easy to measure. The policies are much easier to enforce. So you're thinking about a factory that has a pipe that has nutrients and pollution coming out of that pipe, and so you can measure it, you can monitor it really easily. When we're talking about dairy farms, we're talking about nutrients running off of the landscape in this non-single point way. So it's much harder to monitor, much harder to enforce. And with that, there are numerous citations in this literature saying, essentially, we don't have a good sense of which non-point source pollution policy mechanisms work, okay? Now there is recent evidence that our point source agriculture, which is our CAFOs, they are regulated under the Clean Water Act as point source polluters. So our CAFOs are really the only types of farms that are regulated under the Clean Water Act. We have new evidence from Zach Raff and Meyer coming out of UW-Stout and Marquette that do show that these CAFOs impair water quality. And there's also evidence coming out of by Chen et al. From Iowa State that shows that the Clean Water Act does mitigate these impacts in the hog industry in Iowa. All right, could you just scroll down a smidge? Getting a little off center. Wonderful, thank you. So that's great. We have this literature on point source pollution, but in Wisconsin, the majority of pollution to our surface water is coming from non-point, and primarily that's agriculture. So 82% specifically of impairment to Wisconsin rivers and streams, and 57% of the impairment to our lakes is estimated by the EPA to be coming from non-point. So here what we're going to do is try to estimate the effect of a non-point source pollution policy. The reason why most researchers have stayed away from this is because it is really complicated. In order to get from a policy change to a change in water quality, you first need for that policy change to impact farmers' behavior, which it may or may not, and then you need the farmers' behavior to have ecological impacts, right? It actually does need to change the water quality. And so there's sort of two steps in this equation, and with water, all these different factors matter, right? What's happening in the weather, the type of soil. And so just a warning that this is a really complex issue. I'm aware of that. And we entered into this as a first step and what we view as a really, really important question, but not one that we have sort of the final answer on. All right. So if you're not familiar with the manure policy environment in Wisconsin, all production in the state is subject to NR 151. Now, we have this interesting variation because, as I said, in any place in the state, NR 151 is the state law, and that means that our friends at DATCAP and DNR and the DOJ can enforce NR 151 regardless of where you are. But the way that these state agencies can enforce NR 151 is through the courts. So basically, if you get caught doing something really egregious and you end up with a really bad manure spill, you'll get their attention and they will sue you. However, counties are able to enforce things in their county if they've written portions of NR 151 into their county level ordinance. Okay, so they can give themselves the power to issue fines if they put it in their ordinance. So we have this variation across space, where in some counties, if you're a farmer and you are out of compliance with portions of NR 151, you're really, no one's going to enforce you unless something really bad happens. Whereas in other counties, if you break the code and it's in the county ordinance, then you could end up talking to your county conservation department and potentially getting fined. And so sort of our theory of the case for why this might matter for farmers' behaviors is that our counties, they are living and working in these communities. Our county conservationists are living and working in communities. They have local knowledge. They're smaller bureaucracies, so they likely have a little more agility. They also have more agility in that they can use fines as a mechanism of enforcement rather than these years-long lawsuits, right? All right, so we constructed a data set of all of the county level manure ordinances since 2008. Our most recent major change to NR 151 was in 2010, so we're really going to focus on that period to sort of hold constant in the background the state level laws. And we did this in collaboration with our county and state level agencies. And we documented and quantified more than 40 characteristics. But what we're really going to focus on in this project is manure spreading standards and prohibitions, with the idea being these are the rules that are immediately potentially changing the way that you handle your manure, you spread your manure, and potentially having this quickest impact on water quality. Great. So if you're familiar with NR 151, these are the specific numbers, but we're looking at a set of 4 prohibitions. So you can't have direct access of animals to waters of the state, things like that. And then there's a set of 6 standards that have to do with manure storage facilities, clean water diversion. I apologize, this one is actually sheet rill wind erosion. And then tillage setbacks, phosphorus index, and processed wastewater. And what we see is that these standards are usually rolled out in a very specific pattern. So we sort of characterize our counties as the counties that have gone for the first standard, which is our manure storage facility standard. Then we see counties implement clean water diversion and sheet rill wind erosion. And then we see them go for the full suite of standards. All right, so we're going to see if these standards and prohibitions have any impact on water quality. We also have, we're really going to look at language around nutrient management plans. And specifically, we have some counties that are creating rules that say all farms must have a nutrient management plan. All right. And then finally, we have a few counties that have implemented this certificate of use. So for any storage facility, which means that without this language, once you build a storage facility, it's largely unsupervised, right? It's basically permitted, and then it exists for the length of its lifetime. With a certificate of use, it needs to be re-permitted every 5 or so years. All right, we also do take into account a change in regulation for 16 Silurian bedrock counties, so we're looking basically at the east coast of the state. And this is a pretty strict set of regulations. It's because this type of bedrock is really shallow, it's really fractured. And so any nutrients that are on the surface are really vulnerable to making it to the groundwater. And so this regulation was passed with an idea of protecting groundwater. But what we'll end up seeing is, first of all, this regulation requires nutrient management plans for all fields that are on Silurian bedrock. And it also bans spreading fully on soil that's less than 2 feet deep, and then has sort of a decrease in stringency as your soil gets deeper. But in any case, by really supervising and regulating the spreading of manure, it does change the availability of nutrients for runoff, and so we do think that it might have an impact on surface water as well. All right. So we pulled data on filtered ammonia and total phosphorus concentrations from the water quality portal. This is a great resource if you work with water. It pulls in EPA data, USGS data, DNR data, all of the water quality readings across Wisconsin, and puts them in a single resource. And then we got dairy farm addresses and operating dates from DATCAP. With this, we were able to geolocate all of our farms in space. So we know both what county they're located in, and we know the watershed that they're located in. We got data on our weather, precipitation, and temperature. We know where our CAFOs are located, thanks to Zach Raff, again at UW-Stout, and also from the DNR. And then we know where our point source polluters are located. Of course, we don't want to leave them out. We know that they're having an impact on surface water. And finally, we know how much crop agriculture is taking place in our watersheds. So just to show you our econometric model, but I'll walk you through the important things that are happening. The important thing to know is that we have on the left-hand side, our outcome is the mean pollutant concentration. So it's the concentration of either ammonia or phosphorus in our surface water on average. We're looking at this in a given watershed in a given month. And then for our sort of variable of interest, we're looking at the level of ordinance stringency in our watershed. So again, I told you we're looking at our prohibitions and standards. We're looking at whether or not farms are required to have nutrient management plans. And all of that's going into this set of variables here. And we're estimating that at our watershed level. So the thing that's really interesting is that, I'll show you in the next slide, but we have, our farms are located in counties. They're regulated based on the county they're located in. But the way they're affecting water is really at the watershed level, okay? We control for all the variables I told you about, and then we control for things like seasonal variation in water quality, because we know that, our concentrations of nutrients look different in the spring when we have our winter snow melt than they do midsummer. All right, so this is to give you a sense of, when I talk about watersheds versus counties, this is a map of all of our watersheds overlaid over counties. And just so what this really shows is that when a county passes a manure management ordinance, they're thinking likely about themselves and their water quality, but they're actually having an impact on the water quality of their neighboring counties potentially if they're in a shared watershed. Because water doesn't understand county borders, right? It understands sort of these drainage basins. And so if we pass regulation about how to spread manure in Dane County, we're potentially having an impact on the water quality in Sauk County and vice versa. So this is our primary results. I'm happy to show them to you in table form later, but just to walk you through it, first, remember that we're looking at concentrations of nutrients. So actually negative numbers are good here. Negative numbers mean when you pass the regulation, then the concentration of nutrients goes down, okay? First of all, at the top, we're seeing quite a bit of nothing, right? What we're seeing is that for one reason or another, whether it's because it didn't change the farmer's behavior or because in the short term it doesn't have an ecological impact, we're seeing that in the short term, our prohibitions on our first sets of standards don't really change water quality. We do see that, again, in the short term, when counties pass the 4 to 6 sets of standards, we do see concentrations of phosphorus pick up. Our theory, which has come from conversations with soil scientists, is that what might be happening here is that one of those standards is a no-till regulation around surface water. And the relationship between no-till and runoff is complicated because no-till prevents erosion. That's really good for preventing sediment phosphorus getting into water. But when you till, you essentially bury a lot of phosphorus underground. And so you can see in the short term that soluble phosphorus is more available to surface water as runoff, all right? So the happy thing is that we do see this positive reaction go down over the period that we're looking at. So within 3 years, it sort of goes to zero. So we're optimistic that over the long term, the reduction in erosion might outweigh the increase in soluble phosphorus. All right, but our big finding here is that we see that just requiring farms to have nutrient management plans is related to decreases in the short term with ammonia and in the long term with both ammonia and over the 3 year term with both ammonia and phosphorus. So we know that in the state we've hit sort of a stagnation in terms of the number of farmers that are writing and adopting nutrient management plans, and only about a third of our fields are currently covered by a nutrient management plan. And so it looks like there really is a lot to be gained by just inducing farmers to sit down, to test their soil, to estimate the proper levels of nutrients to be using based on the crop, based on their current soil levels, based on their manure level, the nutrient levels in their manure. And then we do see modest but very significant decreases in both ammonia and phosphorus from the Silurian bedrock regulation. Again, that was 2018, so this is very new, but it's promising. We have a number of additional specifications. Happy to talk about them if you're interested. But to conclude, as I said, we see significant improvement in water quality after that Silurian bedrock regulation. Can't guarantee that if we pass that regulation statewide, we'd find the same thing, because that geography is really special, right? It was implemented there because the soils and the bedrock don't look like the rest of the state, okay? Second, we find additional evidence that nutrient management plans improve water quality. We really potentially view this as a win-win. There's evidence that, that these nutrient management plans lead farmers to optimize their nutrient use, which potentially increases their profitability, as well as has these dividends for in the environment. Finally, we see that increasing the number of standards shows no effect or the opposite effect. And what we're really curious about is that this might be changing farmers' behavior, but only in a way that's going to have long-term impacts on the landscape. And so we really just looked at a 3-year, either current year or 3-year impact, and we're very interested in seeing the long-term impact of these regulations, especially because most of the counties that went for the full set of regulations only did so in 2018 or 2019. So this is still very new in terms of when we think about water quality, we're thinking in terms of decades. And finally, just my last acknowledgement that this is such a complex environmental and policy environment. And so there's a lot left to study, and we're really excited for the next steps. So thank you all for being here again. Thanks to the DIH, and I look forward to your questions.
Is this on? We have the question portion. So I think might be, I know there's quite a few speakers, but maybe if we could just hit if you hit a B to black that out so the light's not in their eyes. We could get the speakers up here. We could bring a few more, and then we'll see if there's some questions. Is there 6 of you? Yes, I think you're right, as usual. All right, so we'll take questions. Actually, oh, hey, and I got her to admit it. No, I'm just kidding. She always is nice. All right, so perfect. All right, maybe just while you're all thinking of questions from the audience, maybe I'll steal the first question. So I like asking a question for all of you for your thoughts. So it's got to be very high level and probably not very eloquent. But kind of what I heard an awful lot was public perception of the dairy industry, right? Whether it's how we're dealing with manure, whether it's somewhat politically charged, right? So the question I have is the Dairy Innovation Hub, we're academic based. Do we have a responsibility to change public perception or just to understand it? And so I'll kind of just, I don't know who wants it first, but I'll get a second one. But, oh, you guys have one. All right. So question is sort of just, maybe not your talk, but just how should we be thinking about our responsibility, if we have one, about either understanding public perception, which is what you all are doing, or should we be working actively to change it? Yeah, please.
I just have a pet peeve to process out loud in front of everyone. So social science is often used to get surveys of people's ideas in order to then change them. this is my pet peeve that I do not like. So in thinking of that relationship between DIH and public perception, I always think a good thing to do is not think of the public as a group out there that needs to be changed or educated, but think of it more as a relationship, and people who are in the ag industry themselves, in the dairy industry, are also part of the public and are also connected with people who might not work in ag. There are already those connections. So thinking of it as more of a relationship and thinking about that relationship and learning from each other, although that sounds fuzzy, but rather than trying to change people's ideas. And I do think with that increased connection, you are better informed about each other and your interests as well.
So that's a vote for just understand it, not changes. Don't even like the term change it. Right?
No, I think the change happens, but it can't be
Marketed.
just top down.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a place for that, but it can be overdone. That's my.
And just to build on that, in political science specifically, we tend to take a more deductive approach in terms of top-down, right? And so this is what people should think. And as academics, I think it's important, first and foremost, to understand the people that we're trying to change and their views, with the one caveat that there is no one public perception. And so the importance of doing an inductive approach is to present, like really listen, what are the perceptions out there? And can we then use the understanding of the perceptions out there, the various publics out there and their views to better make policies, right, that they are going to respond more positively to as a way of affecting behavioral change in the end. So that's how I see that, as informing, well, if anyone should change, it's the policymakers and their understanding of the complexities on the ground.
I think that just kind of listening to everybody and to some of the other things that we've talked about, within the dairy industry, we don't agree about everything. So there's perceptions and things that we're learning from each other, different ways of doing things. And so just understanding that one way of doing things isn't the only way of doing things. And we're learning all the time. So the science is changing. And so how are we taking that science? But absolutely the relationship building and some of what, and I've had an opportunity to hear and learn way more from these two fine ladies in an area that's unfamiliar to me, and it's really changed, if I can say I've changed. It's opened my eyes, right? So from an academic standpoint, I think I've looked at things differently, and so therefore I teach things differently. I said, this is what it is. It might not be the right way, but this is what we have right now, and are there things we can do better, and what does that look like?
Thanks. I guess my response to your specific question, Troy, which is related to the Dairy Innovation Hub's responsibility or whatever, is that I do think that the hub has a responsibility to create spaces where people can talk about these things. So one of the best stories out of the student challenge competition was that there were a few students who knew a lot about dairy. They'd grown up on dairy farms. They were PhD students working on dairy product development. But there was an MBA student who I'm not even sure he consumes dairy products. And he definitely didn't know anything about the dairy industry or the food industry. And he ended up on a product team with two undergraduates from UW River Falls who were both ag majors. And while I wasn't privy to all of their conversations, I would like to think that that space for people who might not have met each other otherwise, let them all learn new things about all kinds of things. And I feel like the hub does have some sort of obligation to create those kinds of spaces for those kinds of conversations.
And just to contribute to that discussion, I think that for us working in that space, because I've noticed when I started my work, I had colleagues call me and say, hey, Albert, why would you want to talk about these issues with farmers? Like, that's a recipe for disaster for your research program. But based on the feedback that we have received from our farmer survey, I think it's important that we have difficult conversations. We create that room, as our friend was saying here, for that interaction between the different stakeholders. And I think that the DIH has an important role to play in creating that space.
Thank you. And I also would say, I think that specifically in the DIH, we have a responsibility definitely to return our results to the public and to the stakeholders. And this is, you know, all of the research we do in the UW system at large, right? This is the Wisconsin idea, is that this is work that is funded by the public and is for the public, right? And so I like to share results with different communities, and whether or not to contribute it to the discourse, and whether or not it changes perception is sort of up to those people. But I think it's worth sharing what we find as researchers with or without perhaps intent of actually changing perceptions.
Thank you. All right. So questions from the audience.
Denise Ney, UW-Madison. I have a very general question. How have the increasing farm bankruptcies impacted rural communities in general, but political polarization specifically?
You want
I'm trying to think of how I bring the answer. You can start out.
I don't know if because we didn't look specifically, that seems like kind of a quantitative assessment, meaning be able to link it specifically to the increase of bankruptcies, whereas the people we were talking with may or may not have been affected by that directly.
They might have known somebody.
Yes,
Or
yeah.
Maybe more specifically, with the bankruptcies, are people selling the farm and leaving it, moving to the urban area?
Sometimes. So I'll just think over. In thinking about your question, I was just thinking of the ways in which these political divisions show up as not exactly in terms of stark Democratic versus Republican or left versus white components, but in ways in which our interviewees talked about the farm and how they conceive of the farm and whether or not even it should be viable. What is the phrase that we often come up with? The economics of the farm. There's a phrase that frequently comes up. And the idea is like, it is not, for some individuals, consolidating farms and going bigger, so those who are in bankruptcy should simply sell the farm because it's the economically viable thing to do. And the sentiment is, well, you know, it shouldn't be that farmers hold on to farms because, right, of the history and the hard work that's connected with it, and the daily waking up, going through the motions of the farm surviving, when in the end, in the long term of it all, it will not survive. So why not sell the farm if that's what needs to be done, and maybe take a job with industry or something. There are others who have reflected on, by all means necessary, we need to hold on to these small farms, right? And so whether that means they're close to bankruptcy, surely they can hold on for a little bit more, apply for another loan, because the smaller farm matters and it should not all become consolidated. And so in terms of the response to the threat of or actual bankruptcies, again, it varies depending on whom we speak with. So there's some support for it, there's not. We can't say for sure there are, based on the data that we've collected, that any of this falls along, again, left-leaning versus right-leaning directions, whether more Republican or Democratic, simply that there are variations in how individuals either embrace or are critical of maintaining or allowing for farms to consolidate.
I just wanted to add that there certainly have been tiers in some of our conversations. So, you know, it's not always people in a position where they are economically needing to sell the farm. It could be they're nearing retirement as well and trying to figure out what to do and not wanting to let go of that history to the land as well. I don't necessarily see that tension as leading to more polarization. I think the polarization is just kind of dripping in the background. But that usually goes to more emotional, personal levels rather than political levels.
And the phrase I was trying to find in my brain is economies of scale.
I think we have a follow-up question over here.
It isn't a follow-up question per se, but I'm Steve Kelm at UW-River Falls, and we've just funded a DIH project that they're in the survey process looking at, I believe the hypothesis is what changes in social capital are being experienced in counties and communities where farms have expanded quite substantially versus others where it's been remained at a fairly static level. And so I just wanted to add that as a follow-up. It's not exactly what Dr. Nye was asking, but on the other hand, I think it's going to be some related research that hopefully is going to tag along with some of the work that was discussed earlier today.
Yes, we have been in contact with them, working together on that.
Cassandra with PDPW. I guess I have an initial question with that. In regards to, you said there was a lot of qualitative research that you're working on right now. Do you have like a second phase in mind with more quantitative for the rural infrastructure? Like kind of saying how many families are tied or rely on the individual dairy farm for their rural community, or the amount of like rural infrastructure it provides, like from first response and that time, that just how it holds the community down. Do you have any large scale, I guess, quantitative data that will be coming?
Is that for me?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess it was towards, your study. Is there a follow-up phase to yours?
We do have a quantitative phase, but it's measuring different things, I think, than you're looking at there. I know there is certainly other literature that is addressing that. I think Steve Deller, yes. He has a recent piece that was out that's looking at a little bit more of those economic type measurements. But in our next phase, when we're doing a quantitative assessment with the survey, it is more assessing some of the generalizability of the stuff that you see up there already and people's responses and kind of feelings and responses to some of these changes. Yeah.
I'm Veronica Justin from UW-River Falls, and my question's for Marin, right? I was curious about nutrient management planning guidelines for non-animal unit farms, and can you comment on like the state laws and county regulations and how those were impacted in your research?
Yes, so I apologize, I should have been clearer. We're exclusively looking at our non-CAFOs. So because CAFOs have all of these requirements under the Clean Water Act, right? So they are already sort of more uniformly regulated. We're looking exclusively at our farms under 1,000 animal units, right? So under NR 151, there is language around needing to have a nutrient management plan, but there just aren't the resources, either financial or human resources, to confirm that everyone has and is executing a nutrient management plan, right? And so what we're seeing is that it's then counties are starting to put in this language around you need to have a nutrient management plan. And we do see that when that language goes online, we see reductions in our nutrient concentrations. Sort of in the absence of that language, the nutrient management plans, as you likely know, are either voluntary or they're for farms that are getting cost sharing, right? Usually nutrient management plans are a requirement for cost sharing or to build new storage. Then you have to submit a plan. And so we're really looking at this dimension of when it becomes something that's not for cost sharing, for storage, voluntary, what happens to water quality? When it becomes mandatory for everyone, what happens then? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I was just curious about, did you look at farms that don't have any animal units, like they're just a corn or soybean farm, and how nutrient management plans are required for those farms where they don't have any manure, but they still might be contributing to water quality issues?
No, so that is, thank you for clarifying. So we're really focused on our dairy farms, right? But we are controlling for the amount of crop production in the watershed. right? So sort of treating almost, we're taking into account how much corn, how much soy there is in the area, but not digging into variation in nutrient management plans among those fields, I suppose. Yeah, we're looking at variation just on our dairy farms. Great question.
Other questions from the audience? I have one.
Yes.
It's a very small one for
Great.
Erin, as long as she's got the mic.
Yeah.
So your data, you showed ammonical concentrations, ammonia
Yep.
concentrations. As a physical scientist,
Yep.
normally we don't think of it as ammonia. We usually
And-
convert it to nitrates. So
Yep.
is that just to represent it in an equivalent form, or what
Yeah,
is
that is a data-led choice. There are very few readings of nitrogen or nitrate in the water quality readings. So we would have very, very low coverage but whereas there's actually a lot of readings of ammonia. And so we're following others in the literature that when we look at water quality, we typically have to measure it as ammonia, unfortunately. So huge shortcomings, obviously, but that's what's available.
I should think of it as an indicator, not as a...
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Got it.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Other questions? Any from back there? All right, seeing no other questions, I think let's give them all another round of applause. Thank you all so much. We do have a wonderful final session, so don't run away. Amazing speaker might be in the room. So a little break. Make sure you reach out, talk to someone that you don't know, and we'll see you at the final session.